Welcome to Salt Lake Azure User Group, or SLAG. We were going to call it SLAUG, but that sounded dumb, so we decided SLAG. Thanks for coming. Good to see everybody here today. We have a pretty good turnout. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Devops and Azure. And the reason I wanted to do this one is because I've been using GitHub and Jira lately, and it really makes me long for the Azure DevOps. Because, man, it is really nice to have everything wrapped up in a nice little package under a single pane of glass that you can do everything you need. So we're going to talk about all the different things that you can do in Azure DevOps. And hopefully, if I don't know something, we have a lot of other people here that have used it, and maybe they can correct me if I'm wrong. And if you do find out that I'm saying something wrong, it's probably better to be quiet because I don't take criticism very well. But just kidding. So who am I? Most of you probably know me. My name is Troy Fillerup. And you're probably wondering, well, why does he have a map of Denmark on here? Well, I like to explain sometimes where my name came from because it's such a ridiculous name. So it has nothing to do with gas stations, which is where everybody's mind goes to first. Sure. My great-great-grandpa actually came from this little town in Denmark called Fillerup. And it was called that long before gas stations were a thing, so it had nothing to do with it. But when he came across to America, he went to Ellis Island. And his last name was Johansson, mind you, okay? He came to Ellis Island, and they're like, oh, I guess his name is Fillerup because that's the town he's from. We're going to make his last name Fillerup. And so he's like, okay, I guess I'm Fillerup now. And that's the story. So it's like, I asked myself, well, what kind of a moron was he that he just like, okay, I guess I'll change my name. But anyway, so that's why my name is Fillerup now instead of Johansson. I've worked for this company, STG. So STG, Software Technology Group, is the company that sponsors this meetup. They bought the pizza and all that stuff, and they provide the building. I've worked for STG for over 20 years now, and it's, STG is a wonderful company, and I love working here, and I'm also too lazy to go find a new job, so that's why I've been here for so long. We're a consulting firm, and we do all kinds of different consulting. We do cloud consulting, we do custom software development. That's really where our main focus is. We also have QA engineers. We have a big stable of UX, UI engineers. And we're always looking for new employees and new clients. So if you guys need any help with any of that stuff, reach out to me. If you're looking for a job in any of those areas, Jess back there is one of our top recruiters, and she'd be more than happy to chat with you about that kind of thing. So anyway, I've been a Microsoft developer for a very long time. I actually started out in VB3 back in the 90s. VB actually did start way back then. I went to C# back when .NET first came out in 2002, and I never looked back. They had the whole VB.NET thing. I don't know if you knew that, but VB.NET is a thing. But I was never interested in that. Once I went to C#, I fell in love with C#. And that's the language I've used ever since. So now my focus is on cloud and Azure specifically. There is a couple other cloud platforms, I think, but I'm not really familiar with them, like something S or something. Yeah, something like that. I don't know. You buy toothbrushes on their site or something. So my focus has been on Azure. I last year took 4 of the Azure certification exams. Those are brutal. So if you're interested in doing them, they're great. But man, it's not easy. So did you have a question?
I did. I just couldn't help myself. So C++, C#, obviously that's Microsoft's implementation of the Java type competitor.
Oh.
Why C#?
Oh, you said Java in here? Come on, man. No, I just teasing.
I haven't used Java in years. But I guess I'm just help me understand what's the C? Is that just Microsoft's marketing or what's going on there?
I think that's what it was, right? So C++, right? You have the plus, and they kind of mushed them together, and it made a sharp sign. So that's what they went with, I guess. I honestly don't know. They initially had a J++, a J#, which was their version of actual Java. But Sun Microsystems got mad at them, and so they threw it out. And C# is what they went with. So it's a great language if you're a programmer. I love C#. So C++ is too hard. I heard that C and C++ are the world's only write-only languages, because nobody can read that crap, right? So anyway, that's me. So when I do these, I always like to start out with a little tech tip, something that's actually off topic from what I'm talking about, because it's kind of fun. And you'd be surprised at how hard it is sometimes to find these tech tips to talk about. But the one I wanted to talk about today is sudo. Does everybody know what sudo is? Anybody? Yeah, what is it?
You're going to ask me what it is.
Yeah, no, you got to give an answer if you raise your hand.
I don't know the exact definition. For me, it's like if I want it, basically, it's like if I want to have like a root LL access, I type sudo for
Yep, exactly. And in Linux, if you need admin access or root access to do something, you type sudo and then the command, right? Just like this, make me a sandwich. What? No way. Sudo make me a sandwich, okay, right? And I don't know if it's sudo or sudo. Does anybody know? I always say sudo.
I think it's
But what it stands for is super user do, right? And you're thinking, well, so what? What do I care? But here's why you care. They are getting ready to introduce sudo for Windows. Pretty cool, right? If you need to do an administrative task, administrative command line in Windows, what do you have to do? You have to launch an administrator terminal, right? You have to go to your terminal, right-click, run as administrator, and it launches a separate terminal. What a pain in the butt. I hate doing that, right? Now, this year, they're going to be bringing sudo command line to Windows 11. So you'll be able to be in a regular terminal window, type sudo, and then your command, and you don't have to open up a whole new terminal window, which I think is pretty cool, because that's one thing that I really miss when I'm working in Windows, is that sudo command, and having to always do the stupid right-click run as administrator is very irritating. The other tech tip that I was going to talk about a little bit is I just wanted to show a GitHub Copilot. Who here has used GitHub Copilot? Who here likes GitHub Copilot? Okay. Who here hates GitHub Copilot? You do. Okay. Yeah, I mean, right? It's and what's the you know, it's always is GitHub Copilot any good? Well, trust but verify, right? Look at it, but make sure that it's right. So one thing that I wanted to show was this thing right here. So you can come in here and you can say / create test for file. No, it's not that one. Let's see. I got to just find it. It's the order service file. And it's not going to show up in here, of course. All right, well, let's try this one then. So one of the things I really hate doing, and I'm probably unique in this, but I hate writing unit tests. Unit tests just suck. I know that they're important, and I get that, but honestly, I don't like writing unit tests. So if I could have GitHub Copilot write it for me, that's cool for me. So here you go. Here's the entire unit test. But you know what? I actually don't like XUnit or mock. So I want to say redo this using mstest and nsubstitute. Did you guys hear about the whole mock thing that they did? Well, so the guy who made mock put some code in there to track who was using it and stuff like that. So if you were using mock in your unit tests, it would report back, you know, who was using it. So when I heard that, I kind of went off the rails and switched over to nsubstitute. So I've been using that ever since. But here you go. So now you can see it switched it over to use mstest, and it's using nsubstitute for the mocks. So kind of cool stuff. But again, I wouldn't use this without going through and making sure it looks good. But I tell you what, GitHub Copilot really makes my life easy, because a lot of times my programming is tab, tab, tab. Oh yeah, tab, tab, tab. Oh, cool, tab, 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 right? So I'm now a tab programmer instead of a real programmer, I guess. All right, so that was my tech tip. So the agenda for today, we're going to do a quick ADO overview, and then we're going to go through the features of ADO, and then we're going to show you how to connect to Azure, and then we're going to build a CI/CD pipeline and show the different ways in ADO that you can build those pipelines. Now, one of the things that Microsoft has a hard time naming things, I guess. I don't know if you guys have been following the whole Copilot thing. Everything at Microsoft now is a Copilot, right? You got Microsoft 365 Copilot. You got Windows Copilot. Anyway, this is the same thing. Does anybody know what ADO used to mean? What was ADO? Does anybody know?
Something besides Azure DevOps.
Something besides Azure DevOps. So I guess nobody in here is as old as me. ADO is, what did it stand for? Active Data Objects.
That was
Before Entity Framework. That's right.
Entity Framework.
And what?
But it also predates the SQL client.
It predates a lot of stuff, yes. It's how we used to do database calls a long time ago. I mean, it was to the point where you would write SQL in your code as a string literal and pass it to the database. That's what ADO. So every time somebody says ADO, I always think back at the old not Azure DevOps, the old Active Data Objects days. Hey, Chick. We have an account manager from SCG here. Hey, Chick. Nice to meet you. So when I talk about ADO, don't get that mixed up, which I don't think anybody is because nobody really knew what it was anyway. So now you're going to get it mixed up. So what is Azure DevOps? Well, Azure DevOps is kind of a full-featured project management suite of tools, right? And there's other ways that you can do all of this. There's 100,000 different tools to accomplish these same things. So Azure DevOps is broken up into 5 main areas, okay? We have Azure Boards, and that's where we manage all of our tasks and user stories and bugs and issues and all of that stuff. We manage our sprints in there. We manage all our work items. All of that kind of stuff is managed in Azure Boards. And one of the popular tools that is used in the industry outside of Azure Boards would be Jira. So if you're familiar with Atlassian Jira, that's what Azure Boards is similar to. Now, there's a lot of reasons so you can use Jira and Azure DevOps, right? You can use Jira for your task management or another tool, and then Azure DevOps for other stuff. But I really like using Azure DevOps for all of it because of the way that it's integrated. And we'll look at a couple of things when we get into the demo to see what I'm talking about. So Azure Repos is, oddly enough, the repos in Azure DevOps. So it's exactly like Git. It uses all the same Git commands. It is Git in the back end, right? So this is the Microsoft-owned Git repos, right? Besides, of course, GitHub, because Microsoft now owns that too. And so you're probably asking yourself, well, if Microsoft owns GitHub and Microsoft owns Azure DevOps, are they going to get rid of one or the other eventually? The answer with GitHub is absolutely not, right? It's the biggest source code repository on earth. They're probably not going to get rid of that. And with Azure DevOps, they actually, a couple years ago, talked about getting rid of Azure DevOps and going to GitHub instead. And they had some of their biggest clients say, no, I don't think you're going to do that. Because we use it, we're deeply entrenched in it, and there's no way we're moving over to GitHub. So Microsoft did a 180 and decided to go ahead and continue to support Azure DevOps. And so if you go look at the web here, you can see that they actually have an up-to-date Azure DevOps roadmap, and they are still continually adding features to it. So you can go to this website and you can see everything that they plan to do. And they've got stuff for 2024 Q1 and into the future on the roadmap. So Azure DevOps is here to stay, which is good because honestly, for all of these things, I really prefer Azure DevOps over GitHub. Now GitHub can do some of this stuff, right? You can manage work items in GitHub. You can obviously do repos in GitHub. It's really good at that. You can do pipelines, right, through GitHub Actions. But honestly, for me personally, I like the way that Azure DevOps does it better than GitHub. Not only that, but the UI is cooler too. So Azure Pipelines, that's our CI/CD stuff, right? That's how we build deployment pipelines and build pipelines and all of that kind of stuff to do all of our automated builds and deployments. And there's a couple ways to build Azure Pipelines, and we'll take a look at a couple of those when we get into the demo. Yeah, so I won't talk any more about that. So Azure Test Plans, that's the one area that I have zero experience with. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but I have never used Azure Test Plans, mainly because I think testing is overrated and you should write perfect code from the start, and you don't need to test, right? No. I'll tell you in a minute why I don't have any experience with Azure Test Plans. And then artifacts. So everybody knows what NuGet is. Everybody that's a developer knows what NuGet is. It's a place where you can put packages that you can then include in your code to do work that you don't want to have to rewrite, right? There's a lot of cases, though, where you might want to write your own NuGet packages for your organization that you can share with all your other developers so they don't have to rewrite the rules for whatever you want to do. Azure DevOps Artifacts is a place where you can put your custom NuGet packages so that they can be accessed by other people on your team. And you can make them available to the public too if you want. So if you don't want to put things on NuGet.org, you can put them in Azure Artifacts and do that. Now, a lot of this is free, but it does get to a point where you need to start paying for it. And we're actually going to look at that next. So let me see if I've got the pricing calculator up. Let's see. I've got the link here. I can turn off my Pizza Hut window because it already got here. So there's two ways that you can do Azure DevOps. You can do Azure DevOps services, or you can host your own Azure DevOps server. I mean, unless you really like managing servers and stuff like that, I would recommend going to Azure DevOps Services because it's a SaaS and you don't have to worry about anything, right? You just go to it and you're up and going. It's like anything in the cloud. I mean, if you can, it's better to do SaaS or PaaS than it is to do IaaS, right? Definitely better than doing on-prem in most cases. Obviously, it's the age-old answer in software development, right? How do I do this? Well, it depends, right? That's the answer for everything. So as we look down here, you can see that a lot of it is free. So you get 5 users free per organization. And we'll show organizations here in a minute. And then it's $6 per user per month. And this comes with a lot of really nice things, specifically in the Azure repos area. So one of the things that I like to do in my pipelines is I like to do what are called gated deployments. What that means is that you start your pipeline and you automatically deploy to a dev environment, right? But then you want to eventually take it to a staging environment or a QA environment or a UAT environment or whatever. You want to go to another environment, but not right away. You don't want to just start shipping things to prod as soon as they're checked into main, right? Typically, maybe some of you do, but I don't. So what we want to do is we want to do gated deployments where it deploys to dev and then it waits until somebody who has the permissions to do so says, okay, now go ahead and go to the next environment, the next stage. That's a gated deployment. Now GitHub has the concept of gated deployments through environments, but you have to have GitHub Enterprise. And GitHub Enterprise costs $21 per user per month. In Azure DevOps, you get that for free for the first 5 users, and then it's $6 per user per month after that. Now, this is why I haven't ever tried Azure Test Plans, okay? $52 per user per month. And I'm like, no organization that I've ever been with has been willing to pay the $52 per user per month to get Azure Test Plans. So we're not going to talk about Azure Test Plans that much today for that reason. Although we could get a 30-day free trial. It's like the drug dealers, right? They just give you a taste for free and then you got to pay for it. Some other things that Azure DevOps gives you that you have to pay for in GitHub is branch protection, right? So typically, you don't want people pushing their code directly into master or main now. You don't want them pushing directly into the main branch, right? That's typically a bad idea. So you want to give protection on that to force people to do a pull request before they can push anything into main. GitHub will let you do that, but again, you have to have, I'm pretty sure you have to have GitHub Enterprise even for that. With Azure DevOps, you get that for free as part of your first 5 free users. And as part of the basic plan, you get 2 gigabytes of Azure artifacts. So those are your NuGet packages. You get 2 gigabytes free of that. You do get 1 free Azure hosted build agent. So when you go to do your builds and your deployments from your pipelines, it has to run somewhere. So you get 1 free Azure or 1 free hosted build agent and 1 free self-hosted agent as well. And then you get 1,800 minutes of build time per month for each organization. And we'll look at the pipelines a little bit more detail in a minute. So you can buy more hosted agents. You can buy more self-hosted agents. You can do all that kind of stuff if you want. And if you got a fairly good-sized organization, it's probably a good idea to have more than 1 parallel agent so that you can run multiple builds at a time. Otherwise, what it does is it'll just queue them up until the agent is free. And so if you're running a bunch of things at once, it could take a while to chew through them all. All right. So let's go look at Azure DevOps a little bit and see what we can find out. So this is Azure DevOps here, and you can see over on the left we have organizations, and you build these organizations that are tied to your user account, right? And so all of these things that we're talking about are based on organization. Then inside of an organization, you have the different projects, and an organization can have as many projects as you want. And you can have your organizations however you want to have them. You can have them by company. You can have them by department. You can have them, however it works inside of your company is how you would set up your organizations. And then inside those organizations, you have projects, and those are typically tied to a specific, project, I guess you could say. And so you got to kind of decide in your company how you want to organize this stuff. So you see I've got all these different organizations here. The only one I care about tonight is the Salt Lake Azure Group. Now, if we go look in the organization settings, there's some things in here that are interesting. So we have our users in our organization, and each user can be of one of 3 different type of access levels. You can have a basic user, and a basic user pretty much has access to everything. They can go into the repos, they can clone code, they can push code, they can go into the wiki, they can do all the stuff that's inside of Azure DevOps. Then you have a stakeholder user, and the stakeholder user can look at the tasks, they can look at the boards, they can look at some stuff, and I think they can even add tasks and user stories and stuff like that, but they can't get into the repos. There's a lot of stuff that they can't do. And you get 5 basic users for free, and then you have to pay for each other basic user. But as far as I know, you can have as many stakeholders as you want as part of that free tier. And then you have the Visual Studio subscription user. So if you have somebody that has a Visual Studio subscription, then they don't count against your basic user quota. So you can see here I'm a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription user. And so I could add 5 more basic users to this organization if I want to. Okay. So there's a lot of other things. This is one thing that I kind of like too, is the extensions. So there's a lot of extensions that you can add into Azure DevOps. And if you click on the Browse Marketplace here, it'll take us into the Visual Studio Marketplace. And one of the options up here is Azure DevOps. And these are all of the different extensions that you have access to in Azure DevOps. And a lot of them are free. I mean, there's a ton of free stuff in here. One of the ones that I always make sure to use is this Replace Tokens extension. Because when I'm building a website, I like to have the version number of the website somewhere to make sure that what I published is actually what people are looking at. And so with this replace tokens, you can have your build pipeline go in and actually modify the source code to put the version number of the build that's running on the website somewhere. So it makes it really nice to make sure that what your customers are seeing is what your build pipeline put out there. So that's one of those. They have some Terraform, they have some ARM template things. They do have a Jira to Azure Devops extension, so if you are using Jira, you can integrate it with Azure Devops, but there's a cost to that. And so I always ask people, well, why would you want to do that if you can just do everything in Azure DevOps anyway, right? All right. So Microsoft Entra, this allows you to connect your Azure DevOps organization to an Entra tenant in Azure, right? So Entra is the new name now for what? Anybody know? Azure Active Directory, right? Yeah. And people always say, well, that was stupid. Why did they change the name? And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because there's Active Directory, which is on-prem Active Directory, right? Then there's Azure Active Directory, and it just got really confusing trying to, remember the difference between the two. So they could have changed the name of the on-prem Active Directory to something, but no, they had to change the one in Azure. So now it's Entra ID, Microsoft Entra ID, Microsoft. Is it Azure? No, it's Microsoft. It's Entra. Let's leave it at that. Here you can set permissions and policies. One of the things that I like to talk about too is the process for the board. So when you create a new organization or when you create a new project, you define which process you want to use, right? So when you do development, you have a couple different things. You can do Agile, you can do Scrum, you can do CMMI apparently. And there's different methodologies for how you manage your project, right? So out of the box, you get those three, and then you get the basic one. But the problem with those is that you can see the little lock next to them. They're locked, so you can't modify anything about those processes. So what I always like to do is when I go create a new organization, I always create a sub-process underneath one of those processes. That's one that you can go in and you can play with. So you can, in fact, if we go look at it. So I created this one called Slagile. Get it? Slag. Yeah, anyway. And we can go, this is the default work item types that you get. Let's say I want a new work item type. I want a work item type called slag item. I don't know, right? So we can add a new work item type, and now that work item type is going to be available in our sprint swim lanes, in our tasks, everything. So, and we can actually, so this is the form that you get when you go to fill out that task or that item. You can put new fields on here. You can say something or something. I'm going to do something. And you can stick it in there. And so you can customize the entire way that the entire form looks. And you can even go into, we're going to go into a task. So you'll see this is what you require for a task. But let's say your organization doesn't want to do hours for effort. You want to do story points, or you want to do something else. You can add a new field to capture whatever data you want in your work item. And so, but in order to do this, you have to do your own custom sub process.
So you say you can add a new one here, but can you edit like that after hours since this is a sub process?
So if this is your original estimate, you can go into here and you can say.
So it's not just
Yeah, you can do that. Yep, good question. Thank you. Okay, so next we have the agent pools. So like I said, you get one hosted agent and you get one self-hosted agent. But if you want to do a self-hosted agent, you actually have to go and you have to install one on a machine on your network, right? And the self-hosted agents, you get unlimited minutes. Well, it's not unlimited. How many minutes are in a month? You get however many minutes are in a month, minutes of build time on a self-hosted agent, right? And to do that, it's super easy. So we can go into this. So this is a pool that I created. You can go into agents and you can say new agent. And what it does is it gives you instructions right here on how to set up a self-hosted agent. It's really easy. You create a directory, you run this PowerShell command, which will go download the agent software, and then you do a config.cmd. And it'll step you through, step by step what you need to do. Now, when you go to create your agent, it's going to ask you for a personal access token. And you get those personal access tokens by clicking on this little button right here, do personal access tokens. And then you can create a personal access token that will allow your self-hosted agent to authenticate with Azure DevOps. So if we take a look over here, you can see, I think it's called that, yeah. So here is the folder that I put my agent into. And you can run the agent as a service so that it runs in the background all the time, right? I didn't do that here because I don't want to run this all the time. But all you need to do once you get it going is just do a run.cmd, which is different than run DMC, right? Yeah, that's right. And now it's running that agent. So when I go back into here, you'll see I got disaster area, which is the name of my laptop here. Who knows what that references except you? Does anybody know? No? Nobody's read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Okay, it's the name of the rock band in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. All right, anyway. Okay, so now you can see it's online. So now, disaster area, my laptop will be able to start running pipelines. And it'll sit here and it'll run them all day long, and then it won't use a hosted agent. Okay. We're going to go ahead and stop this. Yes. Okay. Any questions on self-hosted pools and any of that stuff? Okay. And then we got a bunch of settings. I mean, there's a ton of stuff in here that we won't go over today.
About this, so if you're not self-hosted, you running the agents, does this start getting prompts before you just crash into the I have to do stuff all my time? Because that can get being really inconvenient. You do a bunch of stuff queued up on your agent, and then, oh, I have no time left.
The prompt that it gives you is, I can't run this pipeline because you're out of minutes.
Oh, good. So the hard way.
Yeah. So now I've only done that once, and that was my experience. Is that it just says, I don't know, just can't do it anymore. And then you have to wait for the next month to run it, or go out and buy more time, and you can do that, or fire up some self-hosted agents and run there. And a lot of people, so there's some real advantages to self-hosted agents beyond that. So let's say you need to deploy stuff on-prem. Let's say you have a website that runs in IIS that you need to deploy to an on-prem IIS server. The easiest way to do that is use a self-hosted agent, either on that server or on another server that has access to that server, right? We have also used self-hosted agents to deploy Windows services, right? So sometimes you build Windows services that run on a server, right? If you're not hosting everything in Azure, you might do that. So you can build pipelines that deploy to local servers on your network. And to do that, it's way easier to do that through self-hosted agents. Okay. Any other questions?
I guess I do have a question.
Yeah.
I know that the Azure Cloud, I've used Azure Cloud for Python jobs or Python. Does Azure Devops, if I want to deploy a Java or a Python or something,
You bet.
these same tools and services?
Oh yeah, for sure. So there's, oh crap, I wish I could find it again. There is a website that shows you everything that is installed on Azure hosted agents. And it's a list as long as your leg. It's just huge. And so it'll do Python, it'll do Java, it'll do things that I've never even heard of. I was actually looking over it yesterday. And that's if you use an Azure hosted agent, right? If you do an on-prem agent, you can have it do anything you want. You can install any tool chain on that local server that you want, and it can do anything. So yeah. And so when you go to create a pipeline, you add in tasks that you do, and you can actually write your own tasks that are in the Visual Studio Marketplace. So for instance, at one of the places that I was in, they use a tool called AirWatch to deploy out to tablets, right? And there's no really easy way in Azure DevOps to deploy something into AirWatch to have it send it out to tablets. So I had to write a custom task that calls the API and does all the work, and then you just add that as a task in your pipeline, and now it'll communicate with AirWatch. So it was really nice to do that.
Question.
Okay.
You can use self-hosted agents as IaaS machines, right? If you had some odd build dependencies.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. You could I mean you could use any machine you want. You could have a VM hosted in Azure be your self-hosted agent, right? So anywhere that there's a VM, you could use as a self-hosted agent. And we'll talk a little bit about resources in a pipeline in a minute. But did that answer your question, Frank? Okay, we're going to assume so. Okay. All right, so let's go back into our organization, and we're going to go into our project. So this is our project, Turkey Delivery. So I know this sounds like a dumb name, but this was a project that I built for a presentation I gave back in November, which is right around Thanksgiving. So it was really applicable then, not as much now, but you know, I'm too lazy to write a whole nother project for this one. So essentially what this is it's an application that uses a lot of different Azure resources to provide turkey delivery, right, around Thanksgiving. And so it uses Azure Container Apps, it uses Azure Web Apps, it uses Azure Functions, Azure Storage, all that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to, this is funny because I was actually hosting this in GitHub until a couple days ago, and then I transferred everything over to here for this presentation. So I only have a simple pipeline, and I don't have everything built in here that I would like, but I have enough, I hope, to show what's going on. So here's our overview for our project. And the first thing you see is the project page where you can put in some information about the project. You can see some basic stats. You can see the members in the project. Then we have dashboards, and dashboards is where you can go in and you can customize this dashboard to show whatever you want. So we can see here I've added these two widgets. My Work, this widget is called My Work. And so it shows all the user stories and tasks that are assigned to me. And then this shows some information about a build pipeline. So if you want to add more widgets, you just go to Edit, you find the one you want to add, and you can see there's a ton of different widgets in here.
Are these widgets per user? Like
this is per project. So this is for the project.
Would see your
No, everybody would see their. So
but they can't customize
so
their own dashboard to see.
they can add you're right, they can't have a custom dashboard just for themselves. This is for the project. Yeah, good point. So you can add like team members here, and then you can see all that stuff. Yeah, we'll watch the tree. So, and then once you're done editing, so this is a really good place to put information that you care about your project. The wiki is another thing that I really like. This is where I end up putting a lot of documentation about the project itself, because this is a centralized location that everybody knows where it is and it's easy to find. I can't tell you how many times at past clients we've done documentation, and then a couple years later everybody's like, well, where's that documentation? I can't remember where we put it, right? So having it in here is really nice. It uses Markdown, and so you can put, whatever you want to here. You can, and it actually, there was some, you can do flowcharts in a language called, I think, Mermaid. I think was the language. Anyway, I didn't use it much, that's why I can't remember. But there's some way to do flowcharts using some weird language that I can't remember. So this is a really good place to put documentation. So here's our board. So this is where all of our work items are going to be, right? And so I've got two in here. I've got a user story and a task. And if you look at the user story, this is all the information for the user story, and you can see the child tasks that are associated with that. And you can have tasks linked to other tasks and other user stories, and you can link things all over the place. And this is, the boards area here is what Jira, and Jira does a lot of stuff. I'm not trying to badmouth Jira at all, but this is kind of, what Jira does is all the task management, the work item management, and stuff like that. So you can go into the boards, and this will show you everything and the state that they're in. You can go into backlogs. And with only one item in there, this isn't very exciting stuff to look at, but you can go into sprints. So this is our current sprint. And as you start working on stuff, you can drag things between the different lanes, which is kind of nice, and then you can work on those. Now, one of the things that I really like about using Azure DevOps for all of these different pieces of functionality is the fact that you can link everything together really easily, right? So when I'm working on this particular task, I want to create a branch in my repo for that task, right? I don't want to work directly on main. I want to have a branch for every single task that I work on. I like to keep my work as atomic and as small as possible. So you just come in here and you say, okay, I want to create a branch. And then you give the branch a name. I always like to put my initials with a slash because it makes it really nice and organized. And then some dash work. Or actually what I'll usually do is I'll say something like this, task 6, some work. And then you can see that it's tied to this task down here. I go ahead and create. Now I've got a new branch that I can then get down in my IDE and work on, right? And then I do a pull request. That pull request gets approved, goes into main, kicks off my pipeline, and then when that pipeline gets deployed, you can go in the pipeline and see all the different tasks that are applicable to that pipeline because that task stays linked all the way through the whole process. So what you end up having, you have a really nice set of release notes. When you finally go to production, it'll have every task that is included in that production release.
Does like finishing that pull request, would that move this into like the completed section?
Yeah. So when you complete the pull request, it'll mark this as done and move it into the next section. Now you can configure that the way you want to, right? Because some people they may have different lanes that they want it to go to. So you can definitely set that up to have it do whatever you want once that pull request is created. But yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you. So in here you can add more sprints, right? You can set the dates for the sprint, all that kind of stuff. You can do queries, where you can set up queries to query whatever you want. This one here I haven't used very often, but this is kind of a cool feature where if you have a project manager that manages a bunch of different projects, you know, it may be hard to juggle all of them in a single instance of Azure DevOps. So this allows somebody to go in and bring all the projects into one interface so that they can manage them all. This is something I haven't used much, but it looks like it'd be really cool if you have a project manager. And then analytics. This one allows you to pull a data set into Power BI. So Power BI, as you may know, is Azure's reporting engine, right? And you can set up these different views that you can then pull into Power BI and then use Power BI to show the data, and you can build reports based on that data. So it gives you some really good analytics capabilities in Power BI. And I'd go create a Power BI report for you right now, but that's kind of boring. So, any questions on boards?
They have any kind of road mapping functionality?
For future sprints and stuff like that?
Yeah.
So like a Microsoft project type thing? So that's what the delivery plans would be. So we can go look, we can show a... So that's what delivery plans is, and that's where you would see a graph going out as far as you want. You could plan all the sprints. Let me see if I can get a good screenshot of what Azure Delivery Plans looks like. So it would be some, okay, well, that was awesome. Everybody like that? Okay, good. I don't know. I swear I saw, okay. Here we go. I apologize. Yeah, anyway, delivery plans, that's what you're looking for on that. And again, so there's some things in here that I haven't used a lot. That would be one of them because that's more of a project manager kind of thing, and I just haven't done that much.
One thing I have a question about the stories. So I think it's awesome you can create the branch then, but what if you end up in the situation where your sprint plan, let's say it's 2 week sprints, you create that branch when you create that story, but then there's going to be updates to that branch as you go. Do you have to go in there and reset or play with that to make sure that you're still in sync from... Basically, I want to be as close to main as possible. To
Yeah,
prevent
absolutely.
I always shoot myself in the head when it comes to merge conflicts.
Absolutely.
It's right in a brick wall every time. Because that kind of stuff makes me nervous if I have to cut a branch a week before I start.
Yeah, so typically, so I usually don't tie user stories to branches. I usually tie tasks to branches because they're a little smaller. Now, if you have a user story that's going to take multiple tasks to do, then what I would do is create a branch off the user story and then create a task branches off of that user story and then merge them back into the user story branch and then merge them back into main. Now, before you merge to main, you should always merge from main into your branch first. If you do that, 99% you won't have any conflicts. You'll get conflicts coming into your branch, but then you can fix them before you PR back into main, right?
Yeah.
Now, does that mean you'll never have conflicts? No, of course not, but hopefully it'll minimize them.
I see something like that. It makes me feel like, man, I want to pull the last possible minute. But
Well, and that's why really you want to keep your branches as small as possible, right? You want to focus them on a task so that you don't have. When I do a pull request and there's 130 changed files, I just want to shoot the guy that did that, right? Because it's so frustrating. Yeah, I wanted to shoot you. No, just kidding. So it's like you scan through them. Yeah, I guess it's okay. I'm not going to spend 3 hours looking at this, right? So I really like to keep the pull requests small so that they're easier for the requester or the reviewer to see.
Have you been trying to use Copilot for pull requests?
I haven't. I've heard about that, but I haven't used it yet.
You
Yeah.
can have it review a report for you?
Yeah. And I read about it, but I haven't. And I need to do that because that way when somebody gives me 130 files.
So instead of you just saying, yeah, this looks good, it's Copilot saying, yeah.
Yeah, this looks fine. Sure, why not?
Yeah.
Whatever, I don't know. Exactly.
GitHub Copilot?
I think that's part of Azure
Who's
Copilot.
deciding it's right?
Well,
You know, I mean,
that's the thing, right? So all of those copilots have to train on something. And so the GitHub Copilot can train on your own repos so that it knows what you're expecting. And what it does is essentially it looks for best practices. Are you following best practices? Should you do an is null instead of an equal null? That kind of a thing.
Or inconsistencies?
Inconsistent naming, things like that. And honestly, as a reviewer, I miss that kind of stuff all the time because, it's just it kind of blends together after a while, right? So it's good to have, so again, it comes down to the whole trust but verify thing, right? Yes, trust it, but maybe go through and spot check some stuff too.
We have another question on
Okay.
the live stream. What about using branches for different versions?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you could do that, and that's, the problem is that, so are you, I'm assuming you're talking about you want a version 1.0, but you still want to maintain, or you want a version 2.0, but you still want to maintain 1.0, something like that, I guess. What I typically do is once I do a release that goes to production, I will make a branch called releases / and then the version number of that release. That way you always have that release branch that you published and that you pushed out to production is right there all the time. Then if you need to make a hot fix to that, and only a hot fix, I mean, if there's something severely wrong that you need to fix and you have to have a hot fix, you can make it to that branch and then republish that out there. The problem is then, because if you go back to main and make that hot fix in main, then you're going to get everything that has been done since that release, which you don't necessarily want. You only want that hot fix. So, for versions, I do release branches, and then that release branch is what was pushed to production at that time. Okay.
You create a pipeline then for your releases?
So I'll run the pipeline. If I have to do a hot fix, I'll run the pipeline by hand on that release branch, right? Because you can run a pipeline by hand on any branch you want. And so I'll run the pipeline by hand because it's an intentional release of a specific hot fix, and so I'll do that one by hand. I won't do a trigger on a release branch. Yeah. I mean, typically, I guess it depends, right? There may be cases when you would do that.
Also do tagging.
You,
Check into your main branch and then
yep, you can do tagging.
tag it, and then you just, as you go through QA, UAT, you just
Yep. And it was interesting, I was actually reading just the other day about Microsoft's recommendations for that kind of thing, and they said tags you could use, but they actually recommend doing a release branch. But tags are definitely another option for doing that, yep, for sure. And in GitHub, you have the concept of releases too, which I don't think you really have in Azure DevOps. But all right, let's go down to pipelines. So pipelines is one of the cooler things that I like. And if any of you have ever used Azure DevOps before, you're probably looking at this and you're realizing that something is missing, right? So back in the day, there were two ways to build Azure pipelines. You could do it with YAML, or you could do it with what we call classic, right? So when you go into a new pipeline, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to ask us, where is your code? And you pick the repo where your code is. Now, a couple of years ago, there was another option down here for use classic pipelines. And honestly, I kind of liked classic pipelines because it's a GUI. Everything's graphical. You just kind of clickety click, 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 and you got it, right? YAML's a pain in the butt, if I'm being honest with you. You got to write everything. So when I first created this organization, I'm like, crap, where's my classic pipelines? And then I found out that they're hidden, kind of, right? So you can still get the classic pipelines back. And the way that you do that, if I can remember how, I think it's in, okay, so it's in here, so it's in the project settings. It's in the project settings for the organization. So if you go into the organization and go into pipelines settings, you can see here, disable creation of classic pipelines. Okay, so we want to, well, it's already turned off. Maybe it is in project. Was it in project? Did I just miss it? Okay, oh, here it is, yeah. So this will be turned off, or turned on by default. So this is the default state. So if we turn those two things off, okay, and then we go back into pipelines, now you can see we've got a couple more things here. We've got our pipelines, and now we have our releases here as well. So now when we go to run a new pipeline, we have this use the classic editor to create a pipeline without YAML. Is that something that we want to do? Probably not. And I know I was just saying how much I liked them, and I'm a hypocrite, I guess, but the reason that we use YAML pipelines is because we can then check them into our source code repository, and we have change tracking, and we do PRs on them, and they act just like regular code. With classic pipelines, we don't get that protection there. So yes, YAML is a little bit harder to use, but as you can see, YAML is the way Microsoft wants us to do it, because that's what, I mean, they're hiding this stuff, and you actually have to go search it out. And same with releases. So with releases in here only use the graphical clickety-click method, right? Whereas the YAML, you put everything in a YAML pipeline, whether it's a build or release or whatever, it's all just a YAML pipeline, okay? So we are running short on time, so let's just go look at some pipelines really quick. So let me show you a pipeline that I built for this. So I have an API that my application calls. I'm putting that API in an Azure Container App. I really like Azure Container Apps. I've kind of become an Azure Container App convert recently, and so I don't even really use web apps anymore. I put everything in Azure Container Apps. Is that the right way to go? It depends, but so I really like Azure Container Apps. So in this, I'm building an Azure Container App. Now, one of the things we espouse a lot in CI/CD and DevOps is IAC, right? Infrastructure as code. You want to build everything infrastructure as code. And I was actually talking to a guy today, and he's like, yeah, but it's so easy just to go into the portal and click, click, click and set stuff up. It's like, yeah, it's really easy to click the wrong tier and charge $30,000 a month too, right? So doing everything as code and intentionally and reproducibly in infrastructure as code is a way to make sure that everything is being done exactly the same way every time, no matter what. Especially if you need to deploy to multiple environments. So you deploy to a dev environment, and then you go to stage where your QA engineers go play with it. Then you deploy to UAT where your users play with it, and then you go to production, right? Well, you don't want to go use ClickOps in all of those different things to make sure that you get everything the same, because that's a pain in the butt. If you set up your IAC, then it's guaranteed to be exactly right every time without any trouble. So this is a YAML pipeline that I've got here, and that's probably kind of hard to see. So let's... does Visual Studio Code not let you zoom? That's irritating. Okay, everybody squint real hard, and we'll take a look at it this way. So you can see and YAML pipelines in Azure DevOps are not compatible with GitHub Action YAML files. Okay, if you have a GitHub Action and you bring it in and drop it into Azure DevOps, it's going to throw up all over you. It's not going to like it. So there's a lot of differences that you have to, a lot of changes you have to make to get it to work. So the first thing we're doing is we're setting up our trigger. So I'm going to trigger off main, and I'm only going to kick this off when a file in one of these 3 folders changes, right? Because there's a lot of file folders we don't want to kick off this particular pipeline with, right? Then I like to give my pipelines a name. And what that does is that will show up here in the name of the pipeline. So you see this right here. That's the name of the pipeline. And I like to have that be a little bit different than the default one for a couple of reasons. Because I give my deployments, my Azure deployments, that name so that I can correlate the two. Anyway, so you can set that name here, and that'll be whatever name you want it to be. And this rev is just the iterated revision for the day, right? So essentially this would be 2024-02-13 dash whatever number it was today. So it might be 50 by the end of the day, knowing me. So then you set up variables. So these are variables that are going to be used throughout the pipeline. And then here's the pipeline itself. So I have these multiple stages. So I've got a build stage. This is actually going to create the Docker image that my application is going to run in. And then I've got a dev stage. This is going to deploy to the dev environment. Now you'll notice that this has the environment of dev here. So if you want to do these gated deployments, you have to use environments in Azure DevOps, right? And I'll show you environments here in just a second. So this was using the dev environment, and there's no approval, there's no checks required on the dev environment. So that means that anytime something gets put into main, it's going to build a Docker image, it's going to push this out to the dev environment, and whatever is going to be in there is going to be in there. Then we go to staging, and this goes to the stage environment. Now the stage environment does have an approval requirement. Somebody has to approve it to go to staging. And so, and then we have UAT and we have production. So I have 4 different environments. And here is an interesting thing. We have the ability to use templates. So when you're deploying to multiple environments, you don't want to have to write out the YAML for each environment because it's going to be the same YAML for each environment, right? So you use a template. This is what a template looks like. It's just another chunk of YAML that you can insert into another pipeline file. So that just, it kind of helps subscribe to the dry principle, right? Don't repeat yourself, where you put everything in a single area. And so you'll see in here, I'm doing an AZ group create. So when I deploy to Azure, I need to deploy everything into a resource group, right? So I need to create that resource group. Bicep, you can't create a resource group because you have to have a resource group to deploy into. So I always do an AZ group create. If the group already exists, it just moves on its happy way. Then I have to create an identity, so a user-managed identity, so that my resources can have access to the Azure Container Registry and to the Key Vault. So I have these identities that allow my resources to access those things. And so you can create identities in Bicep. I just find that it's a little easier to create them with an Azure CLI command. And so I do that here. And so you can see that I have this create identity.ps1. And so this task here is running a PowerShell script. And it's this PowerShell script right here where it creates the identity, and then after you create an identity, if that identity didn't exist before, it could take a few seconds for it to become active in Azure. And so I have to put a sleep there to just let it hold off for just a second. And then I get the different IDs that I need. And then I assign that user identity to ACR poll for my registry and Key Vault secrets user for my Key Vault. So you can create the identity and give it the role permissions that it needs so that your application can function properly. Then the next thing is I do a Bicep deployment. And there is a task in Azure DevOps for doing an ARM template deployment. And that ARM template deployment task will do Bicep. But I actually, for some reason, prefer to do it as a PowerShell script and just do an AZ deployment group create, which will do the same thing. It does a Bicep deployment. And so I give it a resource group. I give it the template file, which is this container app.bicep. And then I throw in some parameters for that. And then the container app.bicep is this guy right here. So this is my Bicep file. What it does is it'll create the log analytics workspace for the container app environment. Then it'll create the container app environment. Then it will create the container app itself inside of that environment and pull down the image and do all of that stuff for me. So that's what this is. So this pipeline here kind of shows several different methods of doing things. It shows running PowerShell, it shows doing Azure CLI, and it shows Bicep with templates and all that kind of stuff. So then when we come back into, are any questions on that? I know that's really fast because we're like out of time already. So then what we do is we can come into here and you can see that I started running this pipeline, and you can see here it's waiting to deploy to staging because I have that set up as a gated deployment. So I have to go click view, and I have to, okay, so this one I have to permit first. So now it's waiting for the approval. And if I go into review, then I hit approve, you can see it kicks off that stage. Now it's going to deploy to staging and then wait until I approve it to go to the next one. And the way that we do that is we go into environments here in Azure DevOps. And I have these 4 different environments, Dev, Prod, Stage, and UAT. So if I go into Dev and I go into approvals and checks, you can see that there's no approvals required on Dev. There's just nothing, it'll just go to Dev and be happy as can be. But if I go into Stage, for instance, and I go to approvals and checks, you can see that it has one check in here. So that means that Troy Fillerup has to approve this before it can move forward. And you can add as many people in here as you want. If you want 2 people to have to approve it, or if you want 1 of 2 or 1 of 3, you can put that in here, and then it has to be approved before it can go. And there's other kinds of checks you can do here. You can call an Azure function. So if you want to call an Azure function to see if the moon is in a certain phase to approve this stage, you can do that, right? And it'll return true or false. And if the moon is in a certain stage, then hey, we get to go to production. Otherwise, no, we can't. You can invoke a REST API. So you can do all these different things that will make sure that something happens before you can deploy to the different stage that you want to go to.
If you had paid for the test as part of this account, would there be a test option?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never tried that before, so that's a good question. But you could put something in here where you call an HTTP endpoint that you have checked to see what the tests are doing and stuff like that. Now, you can put, so it's in the branch protection, but in branch protection, you can put it so that it has to pass a build and unit tests before it'll even let it merge into main, which is something that you should do, right? You should never let anything merge into main that won't build. You don't want broken builds in main. So you can set up a pipeline and say, okay, every time a pull request is done, run this build to make sure that that pull request will build and all unit tests pass before you push it into main.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen it the other way after you deploy or push the main into play. Oh, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. So the whole thing is you want to keep main as pristine as possible, right? Main should always build, and main should always be deployable. Always. And that's why you put branch protections. That's why you put these build checks in and all that kind of stuff. Main should always build and be deployable. All right, let's take a look at, so releases we won't talk about. Library, so library, you can put variable groups that you can share. So if you have variables that you need to share between all your pipelines, you can put those in the library. Deployment groups, so deployment groups are something that you use for classic pipelines, classic release pipelines, where you can deploy to a group of servers, right, in one deployment. And actually, in YAML pipelines, there's a similar thing in environments. So if we go into dev, you can see we have this add resource. You can have you can add a Kubernetes cluster as a resource in an environment, or a set of virtual machines as a resource in an environment, and then that will allow you to deploy to all of those different things at once. So that's the same thing as deployment groups were in the classic pipelines. If you ever use those, this is the same thing. So in YAML pipelines, you don't have deployment groups, you have these resources instead. And right now, it only supports Kubernetes and virtual machines. So if you need to deploy to a bunch of IIS servers on-prem, you can't do it this way. So, at least not, I mean, you can do it. There's other ways to do it, but not through this feature. So artifacts, again, that's just where you put all your NuGet packages. And I really like using NuGet packages because, you know, then you can share your code really easily. There's nothing worse than trying to share your code as a project and have people import it into their solution, and then you change it and it breaks something. It's kind of a pain. So NuGet packages are really nice if you have code that you want to share around with people. Okay, one other thing I did want to show really quickly is the advanced security. And where, I can't remember, I can't remember where we set that up. So I'll just talk about it since I can't, let's see, maybe it's in the project. Hold on just a second. No. Okay. Well, there you go. So there's this concept of advanced security that you can configure, and what that does is that does all kinds of checks on your code to make sure that they're following best practices for security. So if you go look at this, what it does is it will do scanning for secrets. So it'll scan to see if you have any secrets in your code that you probably shouldn't have, like connection strings or API keys or usernames and passwords, stuff like that. It'll scan through and make sure that you don't have any of that. There's also, let's see, I wish I could remember, dependency scanning. So it'll go through and find out if all of your dependencies are up to date and make sure that you don't have any missing dependencies, all that kind of stuff. And then it'll do code scanning to see if there's any security problems in your code. So this advanced security thing is really cool, but there's a reason that I've never used that, and I'll show you why right here. It's the same reason as I've never used test plans, is it's not cheap. It's $49 per user per month to use the advanced security. Now, for a lot of organizations, it's worth that, right? Because you don't want to put out production grade code that has huge security holes in it. And so for big organizations where that's a concern, this is actually a really good thing to have. But I can't afford, for my personal project, I can't afford the $49 per month, so I don't use that.
Have you seen any where they use that to shield them from liability? That's what I was thinking. Like if you have like if you're trying to carry data breach insurance, would this activate that potentially lower clients' premiums?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would suspect that it probably would, though, because it definitely will catch things that you may not otherwise catch. But that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, actually, but that's a good question. I can look into that and talk about that next time. Yeah, so anyway, really cool feature, and there are other ways to do this. I mean, there are plugins that you can get, but very few of them, if any, are free. And this is really nice. It's just built in, so something to think about. All right, let me see. Oh, crap. Give me just one more minute. I just wanted to show one more thing. How to connect to Azure. That was kind of the whole point of this whole thing, is using it with Azure. Let's see if I can find... uh-oh, did I lose my... Oh wait, no, here it is. So in order to deploy to Azure, you have to connect to Azure first, right? You can't just deploy willy-nilly to Azure. You have to have permissions to deploy to Azure. And so to do that, you have to set up a service connection, okay? And to set up a service connection, you go into your project settings, and then you go into service connections right here. And you can see I've got two. I've got my subscription, and then I have my container registry. So if you're going to be pulling images out of your container registry, you need to have a connection for that so that Azure DevOps has permission to do that. And then this right here is a connection to Azure, to my Azure subscription, so that I have permissions to do that as well. And the way that you do that, there's a ton of different things you can connect to. This is the one that you should use if you are logged into Azure DevOps with the same account that has permissions in your Azure subscription, right? Which you probably would be typically. Then you can come into Azure Resource Manager, you hit next. They have this workload identity federation. This is a fairly new way of doing it. Then if you hit next, all you have to do is it'll load the subscriptions that you have access to here in a second. Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, yeah, there you go. So now I can pick one of these subscriptions that my user has access to, and then you can either limit it to a specific resource group. If you only want Azure DevOps to be able to deploy to a specific resource group, you can specify that here. If you don't pick a resource group, then you're letting it deploy to everything. And then you give it a service connection name and a description. Now this connection name is what your service principal is going to, the name of your service principal is going to start with that in Azure. So then you can go into Azure, find that service principal, or you can come into here. Let me close this. Come into here, and you can manage service principal here, and that will bring you up your Azure portal, and then you can go in and give any other permissions that you might need for Azure DevOps, right? So you might need permissions to, put things in a key vault. You might need permissions to do all kinds of other things. This service principal right here is the one that you're going to give those permissions to, okay? So if they need permissions to do something that it doesn't give it by default, that's what. So what you want to do is just go in here and give this owner permissions to your entire subscription so it can do whatever it wants, right? Isn't that the concept of least privilege? Isn't that what they say? Least privilege, or most privilege. That's what that is. No, so that's what you would go in and do that. So, okay, so 20 seconds on the title of the presentation, and the rest of the time on everything else. But any questions on what we went over? Yeah.
So Azure DevOps is sort of a SaaS that it's not built in, you have to have a tenant and then you have it under your tenant or under your subscription. It's a completely different SaaS product.
Completely different. Okay. Yep, completely different. And you can sign up for Azure DevOps with just a Microsoft account. Yeah, you don't need to have any connection to Azure itself. And that's one thing that is a little bit confusing sometimes, is because a lot of people that don't know much about Azure DevOps or Azure will say, oh yeah, we're putting all our stuff in Azure. It's like, what do you mean? Our repo's in Azure. No, your repo's not in Azure. Your repo's in Azure DevOps, right? There's a lot of people that get those confused, which is another reason I hate the name Azure DevOps. They should have named it something, because then people, anyway, it's confusing. Yeah, we got all our repos in Azure. No, you don't. There's nowhere in Azure to put repos, but thanks for trying. So anyway, but yeah, and then if you want to connect it, it's really easy to connect to Azure, but by default, it's not connected to Azure at all. And like you saw, you can connect it to AWS. You can deploy anywhere pretty much from Azure DevOps. You can deploy to AWS. You can deploy to Docker Hub. You can deploy to wherever you want. You just set up the service connections to those different areas. Any other questions? Oh, you almost asked one. I heard it.
I'll come afterward.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for your time. Appreciate y'all coming. And oh, wait, hold on. Let me see if I can. Okay. I have a really important slide to finish this out. There you go. All my contact information. If you ever want to contact me, probably email, because I'm horrible on LinkedIn and X Twitter. Yeah, I know. There's a reason for that.
I've got it.
X, yeah, what's X? Yeah, no. I changed it, chick. It's different now. That's right. Ooh, I should put that on here. That would be funny. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.